mother talk to each other. So completely not related to male reproduction at all. But when I was considering a postdoc before I moved to the States, one of the things I wanted to do was, I was born and raised in Africa, and I really wanted to go back to Africa and work on women's education and reproductive rights and education along those lines. And actually, that was my intention. I was going to come to the States, do some science for a few years, and then go back and get a proper job, as I thought about it, and then never went that way. But it's always been in the back of my mind that contraception is something that is really, really important to me. I know that the focus of my work would seem to be going towards, assisted fertility or enhancing fertility, but I've never thought of myself in that way. In fact, my work on meiosis really speaks to birth defects more than enhanced fertility or improving fertility, because I think that many of the problems that arise in meiosis, or I know many of the problems that arise in meiosis, lead to chromosomal defects such as Down syndrome, trisomy 18, and spontaneous miscarriage, and so forth. So while that's my focus of research, I've always wanted to come back to the question of improving contraceptive options for the public. And that could be male or female, actually. But I've always felt that male contraception is missing huge vital links. And certainly as I was starting my lab back in the early 2000s, it was very clear that NIH and other organizations were putting lots of money into the idea of male contraception, but they weren't necessarily targeting the right stage, or what I thought was the right stage. I guess I should give a little bit of introduction about what meiosis is. It's the process during spermatogenesis when a normal cell that contains 46 chromosomes has to divide twice to form 4 cells that are going to become sperm, and those sperm now contain 23 chromosomes. So when you take a sperm with 23 chromosomes and an egg with 23 chromosomes, poof, you have a 46 chromosome embryo. And so that process is very complicated, and really in its essence is just a DNA damage and repair mechanism. So DNA breaks and reforms, and that's where you get all sorts of genome instability and issues. So that's basically what we do. But I always felt that if we could target contraception prior to the stage at which these spermatogenic cells go into meiosis, that we would have a really useful way to turn on and off the process of spermatogenesis. So the first sort of differentiation stage in spermatogenesis is the entry into meiosis. And so at the time that I started in this area, A, there weren't the tools to do this, and B, that it really wasn't clear that this was going to be a meaningful strategy, because you couldn't get drugs into the testis, for example. You couldn't take these cells entering meiosis and sort of test them for specific drug targeting and so forth. The tools are slowly coming about, and I'm not really ready to say, yes, we have the tools and we're ready to go. We're in very, very early stages. But I think that everything so far is bearing fruit in terms of, so far we think we can look at the entry into meiosis genetically and figure out specific genes that might be involved in that process. If you know the genes, they become the targets, and then you can develop drugs against them in time. Another side issue is, while I've always been interested in contraception, I'm not a drug chemist. That's not what I do. I'm a biologist, and I've always felt that I can contribute to the front end, but when it goes into drug chemistry and designing drugs, that's not what I do. I need partners. I need partners with expertise, and I think that's somewhere that MCI could play a huge role for many of us. And I think, again, it would take a village in those terms. It would take drug chemists and biologists like myself and all sorts of people, people involved in how to deliver these drugs and so forth. And so I think what excites me about this area of male contraception is it's not hormonal, it's not barrier method driven, it's actually targeting a switch that will turn on spermatogenesis or off, and that's where I'm coming from. Again, it's very early days, so to say that we're going to be successful, I hope we're successful, but we'll see. research partnerships have been my modus operandi since I started my lab. I've always engaged in collaborative research because that's what gives me the biggest buzz. I am not a jack of all trades. I have very specific expertise, and that will help other people, but I also need those other people to provide me with their expertise. So I think basic science, fundamental science, is absolutely dependent on collaborative partnerships. That becomes doubly so or exponentially so when you talk about things as complicated as developing a drug in time. You know, you need those partnerships to exist because not everybody can do all of these things. So I think it's absolutely essential. What you then need is the means to do it. So financial means, environmental means, arenas where people can come together. And I think that's really critical. Getting people, the right people in a room to talk to each other does huge things. So I run a center, the Center for Reproductive Genomics at Cornell University, and it's a joint center between the Ithaca campus, we're out in the middle of nowhere, and the Weill Cornell Medical College in New York City. Before I started that, people said, there's no way, they're 300 miles away, there's no way you'll get these collaborations going. You just need to put the right people in the same room together and the magic happens. We've sought cheap, affordable contraception for all people for so long. I just can't imagine anyone working in this area who would feel, I want to make money out of this. I want to develop this because I want my name on a drug. I mean, I just don't, it's not like heart disease or diabetes or, it's not people desperate to make their big fortune. I mean, there's probably people like that, but certainly I'm not one of them. And certainly I don't think the prize in male contraception is big enough for that sort of person, right? I mean, heart disease, you could make millions, theoretically, I guess. But male contraception is not going to be that thing. It's going to be something that helps humanity, but hopefully it's not going to be something that makes fortunes for people. There are two ways to think about it. There is the slow, steady plodding that will get us there in the end. There's also the idea that you need to get the right people in the room, the sort of innovators who could not individually, but collectively take us to the next level in a huge leap. Because if you get people together and talk, real magic can happen, right? And so then you go from this slow incremental progress to maybe a leap that wouldn't have come about by one person thinking in his or her lab all by themselves. So that's the hope, is that with little amounts of funding, you can at least foster and engender these collaborations, and that leads to huge things, one hopes. The male contraceptive arena is a perfect example of that. We've been plodding for years, and I'm not saying we haven't got anywhere, but we've certainly learned a lot about about what we don't know. So, the next step is obviously getting people in a room to think about these things. I think, what you're doing, going around and speaking to people at the grassroots level, I think is really, really critical. Make people aware that it's not just about barrier contraception, it's not about blocking fertilization, it's not about hormonal approaches. There has to be other approaches. I would love to go back in time and speak to the people who came up with the pill and say, how did this come, this didn't just pop out of thin air overnight. This was the product of many thoughts and many, dreams about how they could bring about this sort of revolution. And just getting the right people in the room is important. And so inspiring people to think differently and to think that community dialogue is likely to lead to the right solution. I think a lot of people would say, well, the NIH has put money in this for years and we've moved nowhere, is to belittle these new efforts in collaborative science. So since the time that NIH put these funds in to these areas, collaborative science has become much more popular. So, PO1s, P50s, these large collaborative grants are really quite a new thing. And so I think now is the time to encourage people that we could revisit this problem. That's key. You just need the right people. I mean, it's also a good time because we know a lot more about the tools that we can use. I certainly wouldn't be embarking on the project I'm doing without the tools that we've developed and that other people have reported over the past few years. So the time is quite ripe now to revisit the question. Whether it'll be successful or not, well, I hope so. But it's certainly, for the first time, we have new options that we never had before. I mean, the immediate reaction is usually, I wouldn't trust my husband to take a contraceptive. And that is largely true. I would agree with that. However, when I talk to them about, okay, let's say there's a male contraceptive out there, and suddenly there's equal responsibility, it changes the playing field because it changes the concept of who is responsible for family planning. And so that is important. That empowers women. And that, to me, is as important as the contraceptive itself. So you change hearts and minds, for want of a better term, by making family planning a more equitable responsibility. That's the first step. And then you impose these options for male contraception. So to say, oh, well, I'm going to start delivering this male contraceptive and now men, that's your responsibility, is belittling the problem, because the problem is much bigger than that. And I think it's got a lot to do with women's empowerment, education, options, whose role, what the relative roles are of men and women in society. And so I think it goes beyond male contraception to me. I mean, I just think that the point is much larger. I mean, think about what the combined oral contraceptive did for women. I don't know if the developers really had a clue of what they would do to society as a whole with that. I mean, maybe they did, though. I don't know. But it's incredible, right? The potential for a non-hormonal, long-acting contraception that isn't, a condom or a barrier method, is incredibly liberating for everybody. There are women who cannot take a hormonal pill, so they have no other option, or very few other options.